Never thought hiring a plumber would be the thing that saved my granddaughter's life. It was a Tuesday in late October. My son and his wife had left for a 2-week trip to Scottsdale, some kind of couples retreat, they called it. My son Donovan had called me the Sunday before they left, casual as anything, asking if I could have someone come by the house to fix a slow drain in the kitchen. The water had been backing up for weeks, he said. He'd been meaning to call someone but kept putting it off. I said, sure, that's what fathers do. I'd been retired for 11 years now. Spent 32 years working as a licensed clinical social worker in Hennepin County, Minnesota. I've seen things that would make most people lose sleep the rest of their lives. I thought I'd seen everything. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was wrong. I called a plumber I'd used before, a good, honest man named Pete who runs a 2-man operation out of Eden Prairie. Pete couldn't make it himself, but sent his guy, a young man in his late 20s named Marco. I gave Marco the spare key Donovan had left with me, told him the drain issue was in the kitchen, and said I'd swing by around noon to check in. I didn't need to be there. I just like to be present when someone's working in family property. Old habit. My late wife, Joanne, used to say I'd supervise the sunrise if I could. I got there at 11:48. Marco's van was in the driveway. I knocked twice out of courtesy, then used my key. Marco was standing in the kitchen doorway, not moving. His phone was in his hand. He looked like he'd seen something that knocked the words right out of him. "Marco," I said, "everything okay?" He turned to me slowly. His face was, I don't know how to describe it, like he was trying to decide whether what he'd heard was real. "Sir," he said, "I think there's someone in your basement." I almost laughed. I thought maybe a neighbor kid had gotten in somehow, or a stray animal had found a way through the crawlspace vent. This is a nice suburb. Quiet street, the kind of place where the worst thing that usually happens is someone's dog gets into your trash. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I heard crying," he said. "When I was checking the pipes under the sink. There's crying coming from below the floor." I went to the basement door and I knocked, and it stopped. But then it started again. He handed me his phone. He'd recorded it on audio, holding the phone against the basement door, even through the phone speaker, even with the ambient noise of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, a car passing outside. I could hear it. A child. Crying quietly, like someone who had learned that crying too loud doesn't help. I have spent over 3 decades working with children in crisis. I know that sound. I know exactly what that sound means. My hands went cold. The basement door was in the hallway off the kitchen. It was locked from the outside with a simple sliding bolt latch, the kind you could pick up at any hardware store for $4. I slid it open and pulled the door. The stairs were dark. I found the light switch and cooled down. "Hello, is someone there?" "It's Grandpa." "It's okay." Silence. Then a small voice, barely above a whisper. "Grandpa, my granddaughter Willa is 6 years old. She turned 6 in July. She has her mother's dark eyes and Joanne's stubborn little chin. She loves butterflies in the color orange, and a stuffed rabbit she's had since she was 2 years old, that she calls Captain Flop. She was sitting in the corner of the basement utility room, behind the water heater, wrapped in an old moving blanket. She was in her pajamas, the ones with the little moons on them. There was an empty sleeve of crackers beside her, and a plastic cup she'd been filling from the utility sink. She'd been down there for at least 3 days, maybe 4. She wasn't entirely sure herself. When she saw me, she didn't run to me. She just looked at me for a long moment, like she was making sure I was real. Then she said, "I was trying not to cry loud." That sentence has lived in my chest ever since. I carried her upstairs. Marco had stepped outside to give us space, but I could see through the window that he was on his phone. I later found out he'd called 911 the moment he heard Willa's voice respond to mine. I sat with her on the kitchen floor, her in my lap, and I just held her. She was thin, not dangerously, but noticeably. The crackers had been the only food. She hadn't had a real meal since Donovan and his wife Kimberly had left for Scottsdale. I asked her, as gently as I could, what had happened. She told me the way 6-year-olds tell things, in pieces, out of order, with the emotional weight distributed in ways that make no logical sense until you understand the whole picture. Kimberly had put her in the basement the morning they left. She'd told Willa she needed to stay there and be quiet while they were away. She'd given her the crackers and a few juice boxes. She'd told Willa that Grandpa would come check on her. I had not known Willa was in that house. Donovan had told me nothing. The juice boxes were gone by day 2. The police arrived within 10 minutes. Then an ambulance, because the responding officer took one look at Willa and made the call. I rode with her to Hennepin Healthcare. She was dehydrated and had lost about 4 pounds, but she was going to be fine. Physically, an ER physician named Dr. Mia Okafor examined her thoroughly and spoke to me afterward in a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. She told me, professionally and carefully, that aside from the dehydration and the weight loss, Willa showed no signs of other physical injury, but she also said something that I want to be precise about, because it mattered enormously later. She said, "This child has been conditioned not to ask for help. That kind of conditioning doesn't happen overnight." I stood in that hallway for a moment after she walked away. 32 years of professional experience, and I had not seen it happening in my own son's house. Joanne used to say that the hardest things to see are the ones right in front of you. She was a wise woman. I miss her every single day. Child Protective Services was contacted that evening. A caseworker named Ms. Delacroix, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who reminded me a little of a supervisor I'd had in my early career, came to the hospital and took Willa's statement. I sat nearby while Willa talked, the way I had sat in hundreds of interviews over my career, watching and listening. Willa told her about other times. Times Kimberly had sent her to the basement for being too loud, for bothering Kimberly when Donovan was at work. Times she'd been told to stay in her room for entire weekends. She told it matter-of-factly, the way children tell things they believe are normal, because they don't know anything else. I kept my face neutral. I'm trained to keep my face neutral. But inside I was falling apart in ways I am still, to this day, putting back together. I called Donovan that night. He picked up on the second ring, and I could hear pool sounds in the background, ice in a glass. I said, "Donovan, I'm at the hospital with Willa." There was a pause, not a panicked pause, a calculating one. "I know the difference." "Oh," he said. "Is she okay?" Not what happened, not what is she doing there, not I had no idea she was home alone. "Oh, is she okay?" The miss had involved. I told him the police were involved. I told him CPS had opened a case. He said very little. What he did say was careful and measured in a way that made the social worker in me deeply, deeply uneasy. He and Kimberly cut their Scottsdale trip short by 5 days. Here is something I need to explain, because it matters to understand what came next. When Joanne passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, she had a life insurance policy, $240,000. Her wish, which she had put in writing and which I had honored exactly, was that half of that money be placed in a trust for Willa, an educational trust managed by a bank, with the funds to be released for Willa's education and welfare as needed. Donovan knew about the trust. He was not the trustee. I was. In the months before the Scottsdale trip, Donovan had called me twice asking me to release funds from the trust. He said Willa needed new clothes, new school supplies, an eye exam. Reasonable things. I'd asked him to send me receipts afterward, as the trust required. He never sent the receipts. When I thought about that, standing in the hospital hallway, I felt something I can only describe as a very specific kind of grief. Not for myself. For Willa. For the gap between what her grandmother had intended and what her life had actually looked like. I called my attorney the next morning, a woman named Eleanor Voss, who has handled my affairs for 15 years. I told her everything. She listened without interruption. and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harold, we need to move fast." "My name is Harold." I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Harold Sutton, 69 years old, retired clinical social worker, grandfather of one. Eleanor filed for emergency temporary guardianship within 48 hours. The basis was straightforward. Willa had been left without adequate food, water, or adult supervision for at minimum 72 hours. She had been confined in a basement utility room. She had been instructed not to seek help. CPS had opened a formal investigation. The Hennepin County District Court granted the emergency order the same day. Donovan hired an attorney, a man named Mr. Birch, who had the polished, practiced look of someone who charges $400 an hour and knows exactly how to bill for it. Donovan and Kimberly's position, as Mr. Birch presented it, was that this was a miscommunication, that they had believed I was checking on Willa regularly, that Kimberly had made adequate arrangements before they departed. Crackers and juice boxes for 2 weeks. That was the adequate arrangement. Mr. Birch did not mention in his initial filings the 3-day minimum Willa had spent alone before I happened to show up with a plumber. He did not mention the bolt latch on the basement door, the kind you don't install unless you intend to keep someone inside. He did not mention the testimony Willa had given to Mr. Lacroix about prior incidents. Eleanor mentioned all of it. The formal custody hearing was 6 weeks later. I won't walk through every legal detail because, frankly, sitting through it was one of the hardest experiences of my life, and I'd rather not relive it hour by hour. But there are a few moments I need to tell you about. The first is Willa's testimony. She was interviewed by a child psychologist appointed by the court, a calm, patient man who had a talent for making children feel like they were just having a conversation. The transcript was entered into evidence. Willa described in her 6-year-old vocabulary a pattern of isolation that had been going on for more than a year. She described being told to disappear when Kimberly's friends came over. She described being given a bucket in the basement because she wasn't allowed to come upstairs to use the bathroom. A bucket. The courtroom was quiet in a particular way after that was read aloud. The kind of quiet that comes before something significant shifts. The second moment was when Eleanor introduced the trust records. Over the previous 18 months, Donovan had called me 11 times requesting fund releases. 6 of those requests I had partially or fully honored based on his stated reasons. Eleanor presented bank records, subpoenaed as part of the CPS investigation, showing that the trust disbursements had been deposited into a joint account belonging to Donovan and Kimberly and had been used to make payments on a leased Audi Q7 and 2 vacations, including a trip to Miami the previous spring. Willa's grandmother's money. Joanne's money set aside for Willa's education and welfare. I had to work very hard in that courtroom to keep my 32 years of professional composure intact. The third moment was Donovan himself on the stand. Mr. Birch had coached him well. He was contrite, measured, full of language about failure as a father and getting the help they needed. He talked about couples counseling. He talked about parenting classes. Eleanor asked him one question that broke through all of it. She said, Mr. Sutton, when you asked your father to have a plumber come to the house, did you know Willa was in the basement?" He said no. He said he had forgotten she was there. The judge, a woman in her early 60s who had the particular stillness of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible story, looked at Donovan over her reading glasses for a long moment. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The court terminated Donovan's parental rights 6 months after that hearing. It was not a fast process, and it was not a painless one. There were evaluations and follow-up hearings and a guardian ad litem and more paperwork than I care to remember. But the outcome was clear from the day of that hearing. You could feel it in the room. I was granted permanent guardianship of Willa. Donovan was given the option to pursue supervised visitation after completing a 2-year parenting rehabilitation program. As of the time I'm telling you this, he is not enrolled. Kimberly was charged separately. Felony child endangerment and child neglect under Minnesota statute. She pled guilty to reduced charges, a negotiated deal that Eleanor fought against but ultimately couldn't stop, and received 2 years of supervised probation and mandatory counseling. I want to be honest with you, that felt like too little. I suspect it always will, but I was told by people wiser than me that going to trial would have required Willa to testify in more detail, and protecting Willa mattered more than my sense of justice being fully satisfied. The trust was legally restructured. It remained in Willa's name, and I remain the sole trustee. Donovan has no further access to it. There are things that changed after all of this that I didn't expect. I expected the legal things. I expected the adjustment period. Willa moving into my house, the new routines, the school transfer, the therapy appointments, twice a week with a child psychologist in St. Louis Park, who Willa calls Dr. Jenny, and has taken a real liking to. What I didn't expect was how long it would take Willa to use the bathroom without asking permission first. For the first 2 months she lived with me, every single time she would find me wherever I was in the house, and she would ask, "Can I go to the bathroom?" She'd ask it quietly with her eyes down, braced for something. Every time I'd say, "Of course, sweetheart. You never have to ask me that." And she'd go and come back and go on with whatever she'd been doing. It took about 10 weeks before she stopped asking. The first morning she just got up and went without saying a word. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I stared at the wall for a while. Small victories. Joanne used to call them that. She'd spent years working with kids in the foster system before we met, and she said the small victories were the ones that actually told you something real was changing. I think about Joanne a lot these days. I think she would have known what to do from the beginning, and I carry some guilt about the years I didn't look closely enough. I should have seen. I was a social worker for over 3 decades. I should have seen. But I've also learned, and this took me longer to accept, that the people closest to us are the ones we're least equipped to assess professionally. We don't see them with a professional's eyes. We see them with a father's eyes. And fathers want things to be okay. We want to believe that our children are doing right, that the lives they're building are solid, that the grandchildren we hold at Christmas are happy, the other 11 months of the year too. I got that wrong. I've made peace with the fact that I'll probably never fully forgive myself for it. Willa is doing well. She's in 2nd grade now, at a school about a mile from my house, and she has a best friend named Cora who lives 3 streets over and whose mother and I have become something like friends ourselves over the course of many after-school pickups. Willa still has hard days. She still startles at loud sounds sometimes. She still has nights where she wakes up and doesn't want to go back to sleep alone. On those nights I sit with her in the armchair by a window, and we look at the streetlight through the curtain until she's ready to try again. She asked me once, about 3 months in, why her dad didn't come to see her. I thought for a while before I answered. I'm still not sure I found the right words. I told her that her dad had some things he needed to work on, and that it wasn't because of anything she'd done, and that the people who love her would always be there. She thought about that. Then she said, "Captain Flop loves me." I said, "Yes, he absolutely does." She's still got that rabbit. He's been washed so many times his ears are soft as tissue paper. But she carries him everywhere, and he sits on the pillow next to hers every night. Some things get to stay, even when a lot of other things don't. Marco, the plumber, came by my house a few weeks after the emergency guardianship was granted. He'd gotten my address from the invoice, and he showed up on a Saturday morning with a plate of his wife's tamales and a card that Willa's caseworker had helped him send. We sat on my porch and talked for a while. He told me he'd thought about it every day since. He told me he hadn't been sure whether to say anything because he didn't want to be wrong, didn't want to cause trouble over what might have been nothing. I told him that the fact that he trusted what he heard, trusted that sound, was the reason my granddaughter was sitting in the living room behind us watching cartoons instead of still being in that basement. He's a good man. I told him to send me Pete's contact information, because I'm going to use that plumbing company for the rest of my life. I'm telling you this story because I almost didn't see it, because a plumber I'd used once before happened to have sharp ears and a good instinct, and because I happened to show up that Tuesday instead of calling in. I'm telling you because in 32 years of professional work, I helped families identify warning signs, and I still miss them in my own family. If there is something in your gut that feels wrong, about a child, about a silence that's too long, about a situation you can't quite name, trust it. Ask the question. Make the call. Show up. And if you see a child who has learned to cry quietly so no one hears, get them out of there. That's all I know for certain. That, and the fact that Captain Flop loves her, and so do I, and from now on that's going to be enough. The image I keep coming back to is Willa behind that water heater, wrapped in a moving blanket, whispering so she wouldn't be heard. She had learned, at 6 years old, that making noise didn't help, that asking didn't help. So she stopped doing both. She adapted. Children are remarkably good at adapting to whatever world they're given, which is exactly what makes neglect so dangerous and so easy to miss. I've thought a lot about cause and effect in the months since, not in any mystical sense, but in the plain, observable way that actions ripple outward whether we intend them to or not. Donovan made a series of choices: to leave, to say nothing, to let Kimberly's cruelty stand unchallenged. And those choices produced a specific outcome: a little girl behind a water heater with an empty sleeve of crackers. That's how it works. Not fate, not punishment from somewhere above. Just the straightforward, unhurried consequence of what people decide to do and not do. And Marco made a choice too. A plumber who didn't know this family, didn't know me, didn't owe anyone anything. He trusted what he heard. He could have told himself it was nothing. He could have finished the job and driven back to Eden Prairie and never mentioned it. Instead, he recorded it on his phone and stood there waiting for me. That choice also had consequences. It had Willa eating a real meal by evening and sleeping in a clean bed that night instead of on a concrete floor. I think about integrity a lot these days, not as an abstract virtue but as something visible in small decisions. Marco's integrity showed up in a moment that lasted maybe 90 seconds. Mine had failed across years of not looking closely enough. Both of those things are true, and I've had to sit with both of them. What I want to say, to anyone who has their own version of this story, their own child or grandchild they're not sure about, is that clarity takes effort. It requires you to look at situations you'd rather not examine, ask questions that feel uncomfortable, and resist the temptation to accept the reassuring answer. I was a trained professional. I still chose the reassuring answer for too long. Intelligence without honesty is just a better way to fool yourself. And then there is Willa herself, 6 years old, 4 days alone, and still whispering so she wouldn't cause trouble. There is something in that child that refused to give up entirely. She kept filling that plastic cup from the sink. She kept herself as calm as she could. She held on. I don't want to romanticize what she went through. It was harm, plain and simple, but I have watched her over these past months, and I have seen that same steadiness show up again and again, in how she handles hard days, in how she keeps trying at things that frustrate her, in how she gets up after nights that are bad and goes to school anyway. She didn't learn that from her father. She didn't learn it from Kimberly. I'd like to think some of it came from Joanne, that it traveled somehow, through the trust Joanne set up, through the rabbit she chose for a 2-year-old, through the kind of love that keeps mattering even after the person is gone. Some things get to stay. That's the part I hold on to.